just a general overview of Lightroom. It is obviously typically these days primarily used for photo editing, but does have like a very robust sort of archiving and organizational aspect to it as well. Most photographers will, keep track of all their photos with Lightroom catalogs. And so I'll be trying to cover some of that as well, just because, best practices in terms of, a lot of it is more do as I say, not as I do, because I'm not nearly organized as I should be with my Lightroom catalogs, but there are a lot of tools that you can use to sort of make it easier for yourself to find things later. So we're going to go ahead and start off with importing. There are a couple different, so I have some sample photos that you guys can play around with. You should see this DMC train drive as an option under the sources. And if you scroll down, you'll see Lightroom-Ian. There's 5 photos in there that you can play around with. So if we look at the across the top here, we have a couple different options for how we want to move these photos into our catalog. We can say copy as DNG, which what that is doing is it is creating a copy of those photos in the new location where it is storing it on this computer specifically. It is DNG is Adobe's digital negative. It's basically just another raw format for photos. Sort of like TIFF or Canon and Nikon each have and Sony all have their own like various raw formats. If you're working with raw photos, if you're shooting raw and you're editing raw photos, it is probably a little bit easier to just make sure that you're maximizing compatibility if you're moving it between Photoshop and Lightroom and whatnot. Adobe DNG will always work in any of those apps. Depending on your version of any of those apps, sometimes the newer, versions of like the specific, the like maker specific, raw formats may or may not work.
Okay, I can't, I'm not seeing any, sorry. Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so you go down to the button, see DMC train. If you click on that to expand it, scroll all the way down and eventually leave Lightroom and scroll further down.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So
Copy, copy is literally just copying them to from one place to the other, not changing them to DNG. Move is physically taking them from the place that they are on whatever drive, or typically this is probably going to be off of your SD card that you have pulled out of your camera, and it is going to basically, once you finish this, there will not be a copy on that removable drive or wherever you had it originally, and it will only be in the new place. An add is well, what I'm going to do for this specifically, where basically all you're doing is it is basically just referencing the photos where they are. I would not advise using add if you are like, say trying to get photos off of the memory card, because the second you remove the memory card, you will no longer have access to those photos in your Lightroom catalog. Because all it is doing is it is referencing the file path to where the files currently are. And if they're part of a removable drive, the second you remove it, that path is broken. But because this is like a like server storage thing that I can just reference, I'm just going to say add for this. You'll see that all these photos are checked. You can sort of preview them, and you can check and uncheck photos as needed. It does a pretty good job of recognizing new photos. So if you took a whole bunch of photos on a memory card, stick it in, import some of them, don't delete the photos off the memory card, go out, shoot more, and come back and put it in and try and import more. It will typically do a very good job of automatically recognizing the ones that are already in the catalog, and so it won't check those. So you won't be like adding duplicates to your photos, which is nice. And so you guys don't really have to worry too much about this. So one of the things that you can start doing, if you, this is only really useful if you do it when you start your catalog, is you can start applying keywords and metadata to photos as you're adding them to your catalog. Those are just ways that you are able to sort of keep track of things organizationally. Like, for example, you know, if you shoot photos of a particular event, you could add a keyword for that batch of photos, and that way you have a searchable product later. But again, to each their own. Everyone has a different organizational style. I'm just going to say, yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and import. And so now we have 5 photos in our catalog. You'll see along the left side here, we have a variety of different things. We can disregard publishing services. You are not going to really need to look at those at all. But we have sort of the options for our catalog. All photos is literally every photo in your catalog. Once you start importing lots and lots of photos, this gets to be a scary number, and you'll find yourself endlessly scrolling if you are looking through all photos at the same time. All synced photos in Quick Collection Plus are like, I believe synced photos has to do with like Adobe CC syncing from your cloud. Quick Collection Plus, you can set up some ways to start pulling out photos. But typically, what you're going to be seeing is like every time you import something, it will leave you in previous import where it will show you all the photos that you have just imported. What do you mean? Down at the bottom here, bottom left-hand corner. And so, like, you know, find the Lightroom Ian. There are some photos there, and go ahead and just click import. When you have things in previous import, when you're looking at photos that you have just imported, this is the best time for you to actually decide where you're going to put them organizationally. Because if you then decide to import something else, whatever grouping of your previous import is overwritten by whatever. And so to find all the photos, you just go to this, and now you just have a whole long, you know, unorganized list of photos that you're looking through. So for these, you know, you see we have folders and collections. Folders are creating literal new folders on your computer's, like in your computer's file structure. Lightroom automatically creates them creates a folder every time you import it based on the date of the photos, like when the photos were taken. I don't like adding like new files, like new folders to my computer, because there's already some folder structure there. I don't feel like I need to be adding to that. Collections are how I prefer to organize my photos. Basically what this is it's creating folders of your photos that the folder structure only exists within Lightroom. So this is not adding anything to your computer. It's just whenever you open your catalog, you have these folders that you can look through, and they're just subsets of whatever your photos are. So like, I'm just gonna, you know, shift select all of these and say create collection, and San Francisco, because these are from my trip, San Francisco. And so you'll see that when I click this little plus button next to collections, there's create collection, create smart collection, and create collection set. Collections are folders of photos. Collection sets are folders of photos. Basically, it's just like the second level, the second level of organization. If you get to the point where you have a whole bunch of collections, it might just be nice for you to group things, you know, like events, portraits, food, whatever, right? Depending on the sort of general idea of like what those photos are. You certainly don't have to use them. Smart collections, you can basically set up a smart collection that, like, based on tags or metadata, will automatically add any photos that are imported with that meet that criteria. That's complicated. I don't bother. I just, grab the photos that I want to add to a collection and create a collection with that. So going over sort of this library tab, you see we have a whole bunch of different tabs up here. Library is sort of the main one. That is the one that you're going to be typically browsing all of your photos in. We have all of our photos sort of in here. As you have more photos, it will fill and you'll end up scrolling through it and all that. Down at the bottom, you have this film strip, which is just sort of another way to look at the photos that you have in your catalog. And then over here, we have a couple of different tabs. So this quick develop tab is a way for you to apply very rough, very quick edits to your photos. I mean, unless you really know, oh, I just need this to be a little brighter, or, oh, I just need to like add a little more, a little more vibrance to it, or like I want to change the white balance. Unless you know that it's like a very basic, like simple thing, and you know exactly what you need to do, and it can be done with like one of these little options here. I wouldn't bother trying to edit with this, just because it's so rudimentary and also kind of heavy-handed. Because I mean, I think each of these steps, bumps basically the dials the sliders that we'll be looking at in the develop module, like 20% in each direction. It's like a pretty massive jump. And so keywording, another organizational tool. I can type in keyword tags here for photos, dog, and now I have keywords on my photo. Keyword list, this is where you can start to look through all of the, you can click on this and you can find all the photos that have that keyword. Just another organizational tool. And then metadata is all the stuff that is recorded by your camera, whether it be your phone or, whatever other camera you have, about the photo in terms of like dimensions, when it was taken. You'll see at the top here, we also have all of the sort of camera settings, as well as a histogram. If you don't know how to read a histogram, that's perfectly fine. You can do plenty without having to know what a histogram means. And honestly, even I am not a huge fan of using histograms. So, and then comments are just there for if you want to make some comments about your photos. I don't know, I've never used it. So if you double click on one of these images, it will sort of bring it up full view in your library view. You can escape to exit out of that. But obviously looking at these tiny thumbnails is probably not super helpful for you. So I think that's about all I really want to cover as far as the organizational aspects are concerned, because again, it is highly personal in terms of how you actually want to go about doing it. So we will head to the develop module. Pick any photo, doesn't really matter. You'll see that there are these pop-ups because every time Adobe updates, they change things around and they feel the need to give you some helpful pointers and tips on where things are and how to do things. They're not bad. I mean, Adobe actually, does provide like useful, commentary on how to use their tools, which I appreciate because that's not necessarily always the case. So over here now on our right-hand side, we have basically all of the tools available, or the vast majority of the tools available to us to edit photos in Lightroom. By and large, most of what you're going to be doing to your photos will likely live within this this first basic corrections and editing pane. You'll see that we have a whole bunch of other options here. We have a whole bunch of stuff that gets more or less complicated depending. But really, the sort of the bulk of your editing is going to be done with this basic pane. Over on the left, Adobe provides a whole bunch of presets. So, you can open these up and apply all these different preset editing options. Maybe, you can play around with those. Maybe they work for you, maybe they don't. I honestly, they're not terrible. So like, it's distinctly possible that you might just be able to click a preset and it'll be where you want it to be. But I'm going to close that so you can actually see this history. And so one of the important things about editing photos in Lightroom, as opposed to something like, well, to some extent, Photoshop is not as bad, but Lightroom, the big thing is that when you're editing your photos, it is non-destructive editing, which what that means is that you are not making any changes to the file whatsoever until you hit export. And even when you hit export, what it's going to do is it's going to save a copy of the photo with those edits applied. And so in that way, it's very easy for you to make a whole variety of different edits to the same photo without having to worry about having to undo things that you've done prior. And a big part of that is this history. You can go back to any point in this. You can go back to the very beginning. And again, it's non-destructive, which means that you can basically go back infinitely. One thing to note is that while you can go back basically to the very beginning, if you go back to the very beginning and then make some edit, because you've gone back to the beginning of it, you're now creating a fork. And so you lose whatever you have done past that. And that is what this snapshots tab is for. So if I don't know, let's just move sliders around, do some weird things. If I say, I like this, but I want to try some different, some different ways to edit it beyond this, I can click this plus and add a snapshot. And now what this does is this basically saves up to this point. And then I can, I can go back in time and, mess around with some stuff and whatnot. But then whenever I click on this, this brings me back to that snapshot that I took. And then I can make edits off of that and create more snapshots if I need to, all that sort of stuff. So if you feel like you are comfortable with where you are up to a certain point, but then think you might want to go a couple different directions, create a snapshot there, and then you can mess around with it as much as you want without, losing your progress. Looking at the actual sort of, basic editing pane, first and foremost, we have color in black and white. If you would like to convert your photos to black and white, it is quite simply as easy as that. Obviously, you can still do edits even within the black and white, and you can get rather granular with it if you would like. But broad strokes, first option is color black and white. We have a couple different color profiles. These are just sort of more Adobe presets in terms of processing of the color. Ultimately, if you're actually going to be doing editing, typically you're going to be probably doing more than they are, and maybe you just want to start with whatever your base product is without them applying edits already. Right underneath that, we have our white balance. You can use the eyedropper to select a point in the frame that should be white, and it will adjust the white balance at least as far as it thinks it should be, right? But that's also what these sliders are for. If you think it needs additional correction or it went too far in one direction, you have a blue and yellow and like a what is that, green and magenta, to make it sort of warmer, cooler, and then also change the tint. But typically, and then also if you click on this next to white balance, this add shot, all of these, auto, daylight, cloudy shade, tungsten, fluorescent, flash, these are all the preset white balance options you typically have in a camera. And so if, for instance, that this was shot in tungsten lighting, like very traditional incandescent lighting, and for whatever reason the camera was set to something else, you can quickly just choose that option and it will typically get you far closer than where you were. So then beneath that, we have sort of the actual, we start to get into the actual the meat of the editing, really, where we're talking about exposure, contrast, and then also within the general subset of exposure, the levels of highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks. So exposure is going to obviously increase or decrease the brightness of the entire photo evenly, right? Whereas highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, what this is doing is you are pulling specifically the parts of the photo that correlate to either the highlights or the shadows, and whites and blacks are basically like the very extremes of the highlights and the shadows, right? So for instance, the highlights seem to be a little overexposed. So I could pull this down and you'll see that the places that are in shadow, the darker parts of the photo are not changing at all. And it's really just the parts that are rather bright. And then shadows, you can do the same thing going in the other direction. And it's brightening the areas that are in shadow without messing with the stuff that's already rather bright. So one thing to keep in mind about how messing with these works is that if you take your highlights and you make them brighter, and you take your shadows and make them darker, you are adding contrast to the image, right? Because you are basically increasing the sort of discrepancy between the two. If you take the highlights and bring them down and increase the shadows, lighten the shadows, you are decreasing the contrast in the photo because you're bringing everything closer to sort of a middle point, right? And so, for instance, if I've done something like this, where I take the highlights and drop them and take the shadows and lift them up, I can use this contrast slider to kind of add back in contrast. Now, you might ask, is that not just kind of undoing the things that you've done? To some extent, but I mean, I think we can all agree that there is a difference between this, the sort of where we started, and this, even though I have changed some of the values for the highlights and shadows and then added back in contrast after the fact. I, for whatever reason, am kind of a proponent of doing a lot of things that slightly negate each other, but do produce a different looking image. And then whites and blacks are like sort of the most extreme examples. I would avoid really pushing and pulling these too much unless you have like incredibly blown out highlights or incredibly dark shadows, just because typically you want to have some true white and some true black in your photo. If you mess with these too much, you can get to a place where everything's kind of a weird gray tone. But honestly, in the case of this, it might be reasonable to bring down the white some just because it's so bright. So the next section, this presence section, has a couple of interesting tools. Texture and clarity are both going to add, they're both effectively going to add some contrast and some sharpness, but in a way that is like focused on specifically the edges of things. I would use them very sparingly, if at all, just because you can make things look, it makes things look very punchy, but at the same time, you can kind of get into like a Nolan Ryan Batman film sort of like grittiness. And also, especially when you have, like if this were a portrait where these people were turned around towards me, when you mess around with, when you increase texture and clarity, you also end up with basically every blemish, every bit of stubble, whatever on somebody's face, that is accentuated. Any wrinkle, like all texture is accentuated, which typically does not look fantastic for portraits. Maybe that's what you're going for, but usually people are trying to lessen those, not accentuate them. And obviously, you kind of get the opposite effect going the other direction. But as you can see, if you really push the clarity too far down, it just turns into a like blurry mess. Texture too, but just not quite to the same extent. Dehaze is interesting. What it does is it sort of adds back some saturation and contrast, particularly so with like the blues of skies. Because if you've ever taken photos of, you know, a nice view with a big wide open blue sky, you look at the photo and you look at the sky and you realize that the sky doesn't look quite as blue. That's just a result of optics and how digital sensors work. The dehaze, the dehaze slider is sort of designed to combat that. Obviously, it doesn't just affect skies, so it is, you know, important to be a little mindful about the other colors that you are affecting in the picture. But it is a useful tool, especially if you're doing a lot of shooting outdoors in, like, you know, bright sunlight, you know, with wide open blue skies. And then vibrance and saturation are nearly identical. But the main difference is that saturation will boost the saturation of all colors equally. So if I were to pull this up, everything is being increased equally. I mean, it's a rather dramatic example because I maxed it out. But we see now that people are starting to look kind of like Oompa Loompas. They've got really bad fake tan. If I increase vibrance all the way, what vibrance effectively does is it is almost the same as saturation, except it dials back how much it increases reds, oranges, and yellows, which, you know, sort of preserves people's skin colors. I mean, I'm sure you've seen plenty of photos where people have gone overboard on saturation and people look sunburned or fake tanned. So vibrance is usually probably a little more, if you have people in the photo, if they figure heavily in the photo, you probably want to be playing around with vibrance more than saturation. Not saying you can't use saturation, but vibrance is more likely to get you a slightly more pleasing effect. So I will kind of go through a little bit some of these options here. The tone curve is complicated and fancy. The sort of basic, you have a couple options here. This sort of first tone curve is giving you basically all the same options you had with these sliders up here. This is just a different way. It's a graphical representation that you can sort of push and pull this line to do basically the same things that we were doing with those sliders. For people who like to look at histograms, this is a great way to do it. I would say stick to the sliders until you're a little more comfortable with editing, just because they're a lot more intuitive than this is. The other thing that is kind of interesting about these is we have these colored ones here, red, green, and blue. And what these do is you can drop points on these lines. And if I mean, it's very dramatic, but if I push and pull these, what I'm doing is, say in this one, you see it's sort of red tinted up here and like teal-ish tinted down here. From left to right, this is shadows to highlights. These are areas of shadow in the photo, and on the left side and on the right side, it's areas of highlight. And so what this is doing is effectively, as I push and pull this line, if I push, this area down here, which is the shadows, towards the red, I'm adding red to the areas that are in shadow that are shadowy in the photo. And I would be, this would be putting teal in all the areas of highlight. Obviously, you can play around with each of these, and I mean, I'm making a mess of this, but because I'm doing things incredibly dramatically. But point being, this is a way that people do some like trendy split toning of photos and whatnot. Again, feel free to play with it. It is very much like a style. If you find some combinations you like, by all means go for it. But I would say that, I mean, even I'm not particularly good at using tone curves, and I've been using Lightroom for over a decade. So, so this next section, the hue HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance, which you see written out here in these three tabs. And what these are ways to sort of selectively edit color, like a specific grouping of color in the photo. Hue is going to basically be changing. Let's choose one that we have a decent example of, like greens. Okay, so we see all these. We have this grass. We have all these trees. I guess this light post is also, predominantly green. If I take this green slider and I move it towards the left where it's getting a little more yellow, you see that now all this looks a little deader. If I drag it towards the other way where it gets a little more blue, now this is all nice and vibrant blue. Basically what you're doing is you're changing the sort of kind of like the warmth and coolness of each color. Or really you're like, if you think about a color wheel, you're basically sliding that color in one direction or the other on the color wheel. You can get very fancy with what you do with this. You can completely change the color, some of the colors in the photo, and it generally doesn't even look all that bad. But obviously, typically avoiding ramping out any sliders to the maximum on anything is always a good way to attack your editing. So that's hue. You're basically just changing what the color actually is. Saturation is obviously how saturated that color is. Like, again, these greens are reasonably saturated. I can pull out a lot of saturation specifically just from the greens, or I can make them incredibly saturated. And then luminance is literally how bright that color is in the photo. So if I, once again, on these greens, I can make them brighter or darker as needed. You can play around with these. And I mean, you can spend hours on a single photo just for sort of pushing and pulling all of these sliders to get exactly what you want. But also, like, I would say the photo was not terrible before I started playing around with these. So you can usually get like 9/10 of the way there without even touching this. This is really just if you want to go very in depth in terms of, exactly controlling what, the colors and the tonalities and, the mix of luminance between the various colors you have in the photo. Color grading is a relatively new tab that they added in Lightroom. This is sort of another way to do some split toning, where you can sort of use these color wheels and create different feels. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of messing around with these. They feel very Instagram-y to me, which I guess maybe is not so much of a bad thing for others, but I'm not a huge fan of the look. So I usually try and keep things looking relatively natural. But just know that you can play around with how it blends and balances these. And I mean, it can be done well. And I'm sure other people who do this a lot more than me can do it a lot better. But it's a way for you to get sort of a different look or feel to your photo. I'm just gonna go back to the next tab, detail. This is where you can add sharpening and noise reduction. So sharpening and noise reduction do kind of work in opposite directions. Sharpening basically is like increasing the contrast between adjacent pixels, whereas noise reduction is typically going to be averaging out areas of pixels. If you're shooting in dark, in a dark scene with your phone or a camera that is set to a high ISO, you will notice digital noise, especially in the areas of shadow. And so noise reduction will basically try and get rid of some of that color noise. It is very aggressive when it works. So I would say stick to it when you're using this luminance noise reduction. I would say stick to like 20 or below on the slider, just because any more than that, and you'll notice that your entire image just starts to lose contrast, lose sharpness. Everything feels like it's just like uniform matte colors laid out, because it's averaging over an area, and if you keep doing that enough times, eventually you're left with just rough blocks of color. It's not quite that bad, but it is noticeable. Sharpening, you can overdo. Really kind of depends on what the photo is. For something like this, where it's a lot of highlights and shadows, very contrasty, you could probably get away with really just ramping out the sharpening to max. I obviously wouldn't, but like if we zoom in, you see if I pull the sharpness all the way up, I'm going to zoom in even more. You see that we start to get this textured effect here. And that's because it's again, it's like increasing the contrast of each adjacent pixel. So, this is too much. This, especially when you zoom out, looks fine. And you can play around with the radius and detail just to find a balance there. Basically, the radius is going to be the radius of pixels that it's going to be. Like how large of a block of pixels it's going to be looking at a time. And then that's the details, paint in a nutshell. Really, the main thing that you're probably going to be doing here is maybe boosting the sharpness a little bit with your images. Lens corrections, if you're using a camera, a DSLR, any sort of mirrorless camera these days, typically Adobe has, as long as you're using like major brands, they typically have lens profiles for pretty much every lens on the market. And so if you would enable profile corrections, you click enable profile corrections, what that's doing is it is like Adobe has already done enough testing on these lenses that they know what distortion the lens adds, and also like what sort of chromatic aberration that they have to correct for. And so you can just check this, and it will typically automatically find what lens you shot this with based on the information recorded by your camera, and it will apply those corrections. So if I turn this off, you'll see that it sort of distorts it a little bit so that it's bowing in the middle. It's called barrel distortion. And so this just sort of pulls that out, and then it also brightens the corners a little bit because most lenses have some light fall off in the corners. So it's very common that you'll see, if you check that, you'll see that the corners of the image will get a little bit brighter. That may not actually be what you want, depending on what your photo is. With portraits, where you have like the subject in the center of the frame, sometimes having the corners be a little darker is nice because it sort of pulls people's eye to the subject. But typically it's not usually a bad idea to at least see what the lens corrections look like. Transform, this is going to be mostly for helping you get your photos level if you did not shoot them level in the first place. You have a couple of options here. Really, you can play with like all these sliders, are basically all of these little presets are doing different things with these sliders, or you could manually move these around. Obviously, you can only go so far in any direction with these sliders before you start having it sort of distort the image out of the frame, right? And so if you find yourself having to sort of push and pull these sliders to the point that you have these sort of white spaces, that's where this crop tool comes in up at the very top. Clarity. I usually add maybe a little bit, but I would say no greater. I would go no greater than 10 personally. You just hit this. Yeah. No, I don't really push those. I really don't push those sliders around too often unless I have a specific reason to. I think the only time that comes into effect is in the instance of like keystoning, which is where if you have like a very tall building and you're taking a picture of it, you want to get the entire building in, you're tilting the camera up. And so what will happen in that picture is that if you look at it, the building will be a trapezoid, towards the top. So it'll look like the building is falling away from you. So this vertical will allow you to I mean, it's not really that bad because I'm kind of shooting on level with these houses, but technically, that's probably closer to an actual rectilinear representation of those buildings, right? And of course, now I have these, this white space that I need to crop out. So I would say, adjust this to here, adjust this to here. Now you can't tell. But yeah, I mean, really, like if I have some serious keystoning in a building, that's pretty much the only time that I'm going to be specifically doing that, just because these little presets typically are not going to act so aggressively to correct that. And so effects and calibration down here, I would say just genuinely do not even worry about them. The effects are gimmicky and bad, and calibration is for like if you are very nerdy about, if you know specifically the like color tendencies of your lens and camera combination, and yeah, I've never known anyone to actually touch that. So I guess to just go briefly over these things up here. Obviously, we've already kind of talked about the crop overlay. You can crop, to whatever dimensions you want. If you hold down the shift key while you are dragging this around, it will maintain the same aspect ratio, which is a very useful thing to have, right? Because if you,
Is that the same on the Mac? Is all this the same on the Mac?
yes, should be. That one certainly is. If I don't think I've used any shortcuts or told you any shortcuts, but obviously if I told you any shortcuts that are control whatever, just use command whatever instead. This spot removal tool is rather nice and is, it's just Adobe's AI sort of pattern recognition where, I have a brush here. I can mask out an area that I would like it to quote unquote heal. The larger an area you choose, the less accurate it gets. So this might not be great. Yeah, see, it's trying to pull from his jacket. But if I were to change my selection to over here in the grass, I mean, it's not perfect, but I mean, again, that's a pretty dramatic example because
So if you do a little piece, just fix like, I don't know, not the whole guy, but say you want the rim on the, let's say the light post. See that little white stripe right there on the light post?
oh, this?
Yeah, so if you wanted that to be green, could you just click on that and it go?
I mean,
You have to
so-
move it to the green.
So, well, we'll see
I'm
what
just curious.
we'll see what it chooses here.
Yeah, see if
Yeah.
it goes, okay.
And so you can move around the area that it's choosing from. And obviously here I would try and get the
Yeah.
lines to match up.
Okay.
But I mean, you see that in general, it's pretty smart and it does a pretty good job. And especially if you're typically the thing that you want to be using this for is like if somebody has a zit or a blemish or if there's like, I mean, from this trip specifically, I took some photos of my sister and her fiance, and there were like people on the beach in the background. It's a white expanse of sand defocused, and then but there's like a blip of color from somebody's shirt or whatever, and I can just use the spot removal brush to select another area of the beach, and now instead of being a blip of color in the sand, it's just all sand. So it works pretty well for that sort of stuff. obviously the larger an area you choose. I mean, now that I've zoomed out, you can actually barely even tell that I've done anything to it. You know, the larger an area you choose, obviously, because it's literally just trying to pattern recognize from a different area of the photo, it has to choose a same size area of the photo, which means that the likelihood of you catching the edge of something else that'll make it look weird is higher.
So if you do that, if you go back in or doing the guy and say the guy that's sitting,
Yep.
and so you've done his kind of whole thing, but you forget his right hand that's on the grass. And so you do the whole thing.
Except for the hand.
Except for the hand. Okay. And then.
Well, again, it's trying to put San Francisco in the.
Okay, so can you go back and just click on the hand, or does it click off the big part?
So that'll create a separate one.
Smudge.
But
make it not smudge.
I think if you I think it's
Yeah, so
chip.
you just start.
Yeah, I mean, you finish that part, or
Yeah.
you start all over that, or you.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have a second time that you
Yeah.
go to. I mean, I've done this so many alterations, but I'm never really satisfied. with
Me
it.
either. That's why.
There's-
Well, it just gets because you can still see
Yeah.
a smudgy area.
Well,
Is there any way to do it?
so-
not smudgy?
well, I mean, so that's the thing, right? Because it is basically just trying to like sort of
Yeah.
content aware fill.
Yeah.
It's likely never going to be perfect, and ultimately is not going to hold up to intense scrutiny.
Right.
Which is why it's best to choose, like really it's best for areas where you have mostly a very uniform color,
Mhm.
like, you know, somebody's forehead.
Right.
If there's just a little red dot from his it, you just
Yeah, those are easy.
drop it. Yeah, that's very easy.
But I have been, I have one.
Yeah, I mean, it's doable. You just have to, there is a little bit of a limitation. And also a good rule of thumb is you want your brush size when you're using the spot healing brush, and also the area that you sort of paint to be genuinely no bigger than it has to be to actually cover what you're trying to cover up. Because again, the larger the area, the more likely that it's going to pull from some, you know, some edge of something that is going to end up looking weird in the long run.
Easier to do it in Photoshop?
Yeah.
So Photoshop has a very similar, Photoshop has content aware fill, which is basically a very similar tool. And I don't know, I feel like it's a bit of a toss up. It depends on how in depth you want to get in Photoshop. You can probably do it a little bit more nuanced than this, but this is certainly like a lot easier than porting this out to Photoshop and then, you know, doing all sorts of layer masks and whatnot. But you know, obviously there's a trade-off there. And obviously, as you've seen, if I can just click on these dots and delete them if I decide that I don't actually want that. So this is the new thing that they have added as of Adobe CC 2022. Or the 2022 version of Lightroom Classic. So these are, they basically added some automatic masking options, which are pretty nice. There's one that automatically detects your subject, which allows you to make sort of localized edits to specifically your subject. And they've done the same for the sky as well. So if I say select sky, it's going to detect the sky. Hopefully, maybe using all of the horsepower of this computer. But I mean, that should be theoretically pretty easy, right? It's just all this up here. This was working a lot faster on my computer moments ago.
No.
These are not super robust computers in here, so I'm not surprised it's taking a little while. Just going to have to cancel this.
What would it do? Create an outline?
So what we'll do is in theory, it is going to basically create a mask that is specifically being applied to all of this blue up here. Yes. I am going to cancel this because it's taking forever.
And you select this one, or you?
Well, so that's so there's this. It's basically AI identifying what the sky is versus what the subject is. Well, so I mean, so the thing is, all that is doing is it is creating a mask for it. It is not actually applying any edits. You then get to control what the edits it is applying are. But we do see these other options here, which are sort of the more traditional ones: linear gradient, radial gradient, and brush. So radial gradient, what you can do is you can create an oval or a circle. And what this is doing, this sort of inner circle is sort of the main edits, and then it sort of feathers off to the larger circle. And so you see how this is a, the whatever edit I'm saying here, which is like dropping the exposure, is applied fully here, and then it sort of feathers off out to the edges. Or you could go the other direction. Increase contrast, decrease highlights. Right, you basically have all the options you had in here before, but now you're applying sort of targeted edits to a specific part of the image. This is not a great photo for a radial gradient, but a linear gradient might actually help us pretty well. So what we can do here is we can click and drag a line. And what we're doing is we are setting up a gradient where wherever we started is where the edits sort of are being applied. And then as we drag, those edits are getting feathered out into the rest of the photo along that path. So area of most edits, feathers until no edits. So for this, we could say, add some dehaze. Maybe drop the exposure a little bit. It's a little dramatic on the dehaze, but. And so if we were to go back to this, we see that the edit is being applied. Like linear gradients are actually really good for horizon line type stuff, right? For if you have a relatively clear definition between your sky and the ground, it's very easy to use a linear gradient to sort of apply the edits to the sky or the ground as needed, because I could even go the other direction and brighten things here, right? And so now I have like basically competing gradients where before edits and after edits. And then, of course, the sort of last major one is this brush, which literally you brush exactly the areas of the photo that you want to apply the edit to. And so you can get as specific or non-specific as you want with that. You can paint entire areas, you can paint just a person, you can paint a part of a person. One thing that's a useful shortcut that doesn't require any command keys or anything is, so the bracket keys on your keyboard increase and decrease the brush size over by P. So the open brackets will decrease, closed brackets will increase the brush size. That's just an easy way to increase and decrease the size as needed. And you'll see, and so you notice that there is like there's like an inner circle and an outer circle. Once again, that's sort of the feathering of the mask. Wherever the inner circle touches is applying sort of direct edits, and then if you sort of leave the edge of the outer circle across an area, like sweep that across an area, it will be sort of not 100% of the edits. It will be feathered into the area where there is none. So those are just a couple of the ways that you can use masks. They also have these color range and luminance range. What those are is those are going to be masks. These are likely are not going to work all that great for similar. That worked a lot faster. So what these are doing is you basically are going to use the eyedropper to select either a color in the case of color range like this, and it will auto detect areas of that color in the image, which will allow you to apply edits to specifically things of that color. Luminance is the same idea, except obviously it's going to be areas of that brightness. It's like, well, it's basically choosing all the highlights. So I could say, drag all those down. Yeah, works reasonably well. So those you could do in previous versions. They just weren't quite so easy to find. And they did, I do appreciate that they now have this sort of mask layer, pop out that's visible. Whereas before, basically all you had were these like the little dots on the screen, like we had with the spot healing. And you would have to like flip between those and remember which ones were actually, the ones that you were using for what parts. This, you have a little more control and it's a little organizationally nicer. All right. So once you are happy with where your picture is, and I know that I've done a whole bunch of stuff to this, but going back to the original versus where we ended up, you can do quite a bit. If you go to export, that's how you actually get your fully edited photo in a usable format. You have to click back to the library side of things, and you can hit export down in the corner next to where import is. You can choose obviously where you want it to export the file to. You can change file naming. You can rename them if you want to have something that means more than the string of letters and numbers that your camera probably gave it as a name. And then you have your file settings. You can save them as JPEGs, which are compressed file formats. You can save it as DNG, TIFF, whatever the original file format is, which will preserve the ability to edit them, sort of like we're doing here. JPEG, basically what it's doing is it's taking all the edits and it's compressing them into the file. So at that point, you kind of can't undo. But again, that's fine because this is non-destructive. You still have the original file anyway. You're just creating a copy that has these edits. Typically, if you're going to be posting these online, JPEG is perfectly fine. You do not need to be posting like uncompressed raw files on your on your Instagram or what have you. So yes, but you lose far more quality with the compression when you upload things to Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever, because they compress the file further, right? And so you can try and upload like a DNG or any sort of raw file to Instagram. You can test. You can try that as well as the same image just export as a JPEG. You will likely see that if anything, it will probably do worse with processing the raw file. But ultimately, there is going to be a loss of quality, and the biggest loss of quality is going to be when you upload it, not when you're exporting it. So, I mean, again, if you're going to be posting it online for people to view online, JPEG. Partially because the other thing is, if you're say posting this on your own website or whatever, where you have more control and are not going to be compressing it further, sure, you'll retain all the original quality if you save it as the original file type, uncompressed, full resolution. But depending on how big the original file is, it will take forever to load on a web page, because as it turns out, things tend to not load super well above like 5 megabytes on a web page. Like if you've ever gone and looked at like a photographer's website or whatever, and like their like rotating carousel of images like takes a little while to load. That's probably because they're trying to use like the original, max resolution, which like, again, looks very nice. But if, you have to sit there and wait 30 seconds for it to load, kind of defeats
But
some of the
if
purpose.
you're exporting it printed,
Yes.
would you use JPEG or what would you use?
So it depends on exactly how you're printing it. If you're printing it from the same computer that you're using here, I would you could certainly just use the print module in Lightroom. That gets a little finicky depending on what printer and whatnot you have that you're using. If you like, ideally you would, so if you're printing anything larger than 16 by 20, you probably should be exporting it as whatever. If it starts off as an uncompressed file, you should probably export it as that and then try and print it from Photoshop or something that can load your uncompressed file. But like realistically, you're not going to notice the decrease in quality from exporting like a max resolution JPEG on anything like 16 by 20 or smaller. But like 16 by 20 is probably the max size that you would really want to print a JPEG. Like if you are coming in to print on our plotter,
Well, sure.
But like even then you're also like realistically you're also sort of running into issues with like how high is the resolution of the original image really, right? Because at some point the issue becomes scalability of the image more so than the actual like quality of the file, because there's only so this is 5,472 pixels in its long dimension. If you're trying to print at 300 DPI, 5,400 divided by 300, that's your max dimensions that you can print at 300 DPI. And so obviously the bigger you go, you are going to experience a drop off in quality. But that's not a result of what you're, the compression. That's a result of just how big, how like the actual physical dimensions of the file in terms of pixels. So most, if you're trying to print out a massive banner, it's not going to look great up close. But also theoretically, you're not expecting it to. So, but yeah, so obviously, you hit export and you'll see a little, pop up here and it'll have a little taskbar that progresses. Exporting one is easy enough. If I selected all of these, you can export multiple files at a time. You don't have to do them one by one. And you can, make sure that they're grouped together in subfolders or whatever. But, so I think that's at least a good introduction to Lightroom. I've gone over a lot. Do you have any specific questions that I haven't covered yet? Cool. Thank y'all for showing up.